Good afternoon or good evening, depending on where you may be listening to this show from in this beautiful world of ours. This is Michael Cross with another edition of Unlock the Door Radio here on UCY TV Productions. And today, I would like to go over a topic that will tie together the Confederacy, the Soviet Union, and, well, a lot of other subjects that you may not find are interrelated. But just give a chance and hear out the commentary and see what you think. Before I go on with this, though, I would invite people to check out past shows, and I record most of those on YouTube, and you can find that at Michael Cross, and it's the one with the, that'll come up and say Freedom from Conscience, my book series, and also check out my website at michaelcross.net, and if you're on Twitter, which many of you are, please follow me, and my name there is Psycho Mike 777. Okay, now that I've done that plug, let's get into the subject. Okay, now you're probably wondering how the heck can you tie in, how in the heck can you put together the Confederacy and the Soviet Union? Well, what I would like to deal with is a whole aspect of erasing culture. Yes, erasing culture. I personally don't think that it's, I personally think that it's a good idea for people to remember their past. I personally think it's a good idea for people to have pride in where they came from. And I'll read you a quote here, and it's a quote that I leave on my website in an article that's entitled Tap into the Wisdom of Your Ancestors. Again, that's at michaelcross.net. And it's from Marcus Garvey. And it just simply says, a people without the knowledge of their past history, origin, and culture is like a tree without roots. Let me read that again. A people without the knowledge of their past history, origin, and culture is like a tree without roots. And what he means by that is simple. You need to know where you came from. You need to know what your ancestors had to go through in order to know who you are today and where your future is. Now, before I get into the Confederacy and the Soviet Union, what I would like to say is this. Every single government, every single ethnic group on the face of the earth, every single religion and institutions associated with that religion, and even every family has very positive aspects to their history, very negative aspects to their history, and a lot of history is kind of boring. And that's probably makes up like 99% or more of the history. But the thing is, we tend to as people sensationalize. We tend to look at things that are unusual, and that's what catches our attention. So ultimately, if, for instance, on a TV show, if you have a situation comedy in which all you did was show, dad comes home from work and says hi to the kids, mom's doing something, and it's just kind of like a general everyday, this is what an average family is like, throw in a few jokes here or there, it's going to have low ratings. People are not going to want to watch that because it's going to be boring. So instead, our most successful comedies on television have been those that have pushed the envelope, that have dealt with the unusual, in which you have characters that are a little bit rooted in reality, but then it's taken to an extreme. And that's what amuses us. And then, of course, the sad part about that is that each subsequent comedy has to try to push the envelope a little bit more in order to get viewers. Well, the teaching of history is sort of like that too. And so what happens in the past, I'll say like maybe the way history was taught in maybe the 1950s in the public school system, and I mean K through 12, is essentially that you taught the things that are honorable. Very much like Plato felt history should be dealt with. You showed your particular country as being like this shining light on a hill. It was all the good stuff, all the wonderful things that leaders in the past did to overcome odds. And when you presented other cultures or countries and so forth, often they got a little demonized if they went against you. And so this created in the public a sense of America being right all the time. I used to wonder about that when I was a kid. You'd see these war movies, and no matter what the war was, there was people fighting against America. And I was thinking to myself, why would they do that? Don't they know they're fighting the good guys all the time? Well, when you're like 5 or 6 years old, then that is going to be the way you think. Why is America always the good guy? And the thing is that this was really reinforced until I would say probably late 60s, early 70s. But that was the model. Okay? George Washington never told a lie. Well, obviously we know he did. He was a politician, and sometimes you had to lie, when you were involved in espionage when it comes to the war that he was conducting against the British. Abe Lincoln, his number one goal was to free the slaves. Well, the more you learn about it, the less that really becomes the number one goal. And of course, anytime America was drawn into a war, it was to fight evil and to save people. Well, the more you study, the more you find that's not really the case. But the thing is this, there was always this sense that you honored tradition, whatever those traditions were. You did not put them down. Now, the other part of history I will note is that history is written by academics. And academics tend to look towards the ruling class as their model. That's why, for instance, when you study history, it can be very boring because you learn a lot about, depending on what country you're in, you learn a lot about kings, you learn a lot about presidents, you learn about, if you're studying the era of the late 1800s and early 1900s, you're learning about Rockefeller and Carnegie and people like that. If you do learn anything about how regular people lived, it tends to be, dealing with like garment workers in New York, immigrant populations coming in and so forth, and working in the factories. And you may remember lessons about Upton Sinclair and the jungle and these kinds of books. But you very rarely learn about what life was like kind of just for everyday American people. If you're dealing with America, if you're in Britain, the same would be true of everyday British people and so forth. And that's because there is a tendency for academics to write about the people that are in power and not the people themselves that make up 99% of the population. So it's sort of like they get forgotten. But ultimately, that's an area that I think is a big disservice, because we should connect to our families, because we have to remember what the people went through that gave us life in the first place. We have to remember the sacrifices. And you think about the sacrifices of just 100 generations. 100 generations. Your ancestors, in order to get you here, had to survive long enough to reproduce. And in the course of that, they had to survive plagues, crazy kings, emperors, Mongol hordes, rampaging, other types of diseases, hunger, because in the old days, if the crops failed, very often you failed, you died. There was no one coming along with a UN relief effort, or there was no government coming along with food stamps. I mean, people did die of starvation up until recent history. The thing is, life was almost a kind of a hot, I'm not a big fan of Thomas Hobbes, but Hobbes did say, natural life was sort of, short and brutal. The thing is that people still pulled together. They created traditions. They created customs. They gave meaning to life. They came up with all kinds of wonderful symbolism and so forth. Sadly, much of that symbolism was, I'll get to this later, sadly, much of that symbolism was destroyed by, entities like the Catholic Church when they would come into an area and take over. Usually through some king, deals made with kings or queens or so forth. And, when they converted, they expected everyone to convert. Well, a lot of those traditions, they get changed. Okay? I mean, even this recording's being done around the Christmas holidays. And Christmas itself, I mean, if you read up on, what most historians would say would be the time period Jesus was born, he'd be born in early April. But the Catholic Church was in a competition with local customs. And so, like the Romans, they had the Feast of Saturnus, I believe. Peoples in the north, they had a variety of customs associated with the changing of the seasons, because the winter equinox was the shortest day of the year, and now you were kind of celebrating, it's now going to be longer days each day, and it's going to warm up as time goes on. And so they had all kinds of celebrations. Many of them were associated with fertility. Because see, in the past, we honored fertility. Nowadays, it's the number one goal of sex education is, the worst thing could ever happen to you is to have sex and get pregnant. The ancient peoples, they didn't just run around like a bunch of rabbits during mating season or something like that, but they saw the birth of a child as being a very sacred and beautiful event. It was part of the creation. And so many of the things we associate with fertility and so forth, they weren't like they're presented, for the most part. They weren't like they're presented in some sort of cheap English horror movie or something like that from the 1960s. These were celebrations that, like for instance, the Christmas ham was think about the irony there, okay? The Christmas ham. Jesus never ate ham, okay? I mean, I think we're pretty clear on that one. Jesus did not eat pigs. But we have Christmas ham. Where did that come from? Well, I looked it up because it's like, that sounds really weird. And northern peoples would sacrifice a pig in honor of Freya, the Nordic goddess of variety of things, but particularly of fertility. And so therefore, the ham is a connection to that, even though most people don't know it. I heard that the red and white being associated with Christmas has to do with that time period. These colors were associated with when you made a sacrifice and hung it up in a tree, the blood would be dripping into the snow, and so red and white became colors. So, see, a lot of the things that we do have a connection to our past. And, we've just kind of forgotten it, or it's been glossed over. We have Santa Claus, who's more of a marketing, that had to do more with marketing soda back 100 years ago or so forth. But anyway, back to the traditions. We should actually, try to know what our ancestors went through and honor them, as the Bible says. Honor thy father and thy mother, that thy days may be long upon the earth, or the land. And the thing is that I believe that honoring is not just, oh, dad and mom, you're great. It has to do with honoring mom and dad, and then the chain that goes all the way back, grandparents, so forth. Now, you're probably thinking, well, what if my ancestors weren't so honorable? You know what? Like I said before, every country, every people, every religion has done something bad, okay? And the problem is we tend to focus on it. It's like, oh my gosh, because there's a big change that took place after the whole 60s and early 70s of, question authority, and it didn't question authority as into let's, look at ethics and so forth like Benjamin Franklin would have promoted and try to do better. It turned into let's tear down the past. Let's look at everything as negative. Let's look at all of the motivations of the pioneers coming across the plains as being evil and brutal, and then we create these new stories that emphasize exploitation and destruction, and the left just eats this up, okay? Because they want to emphasize how bad our history is and how bad our ancestors were, because that gets people to feeling guilty. And then when they feel guilty, then the left can come along and say, hey, you know what? In order to make amends for the evil of your ways and your ancestors, let's go ahead and say we need to do this or that. Whatever the left says is usually, it's like a religion. They're kind of like, give us penance and buy your indulgences by following whatever the left's agenda is. Because if you don't, you're a bad person and you reflect all the badness of whatever your culture was. And it's kind of an ingenious way of using weaponized psychology. But ultimately, if people are aware of have a comprehensive awareness of their past, they understand that that's bogus. But if they don't, and all they've heard is the bad stuff, then they become prey to this kind of mentality. Now, the thing is, let's just look at a family, for instance. Let's say your great-grandfather, you find out, was a horse thief. Okay? So what? You maybe then you feel like, oh my gosh, I come from bad blood and all this kind of stuff. Well, that's not looking at it very comprehensively. First of all, you have to wonder, what were the reasons why he was a horse thief? Did he steal horses because he was just evil? Kind of a Snidely Whiplash from the old Bullwinkle and Rocky series. Just trying to do bad just for the sake of being bad. Maybe he didn't have money. Maybe he needed a horse for whatever reason. Maybe someone had cheated him out of something and he was stealing the horse to get back at them for it. The thing is, let's just say he was evil. Let's say, he had the handlebar mustache and the black cloak and everything, and he just was a bad guy. Well, that's one ancestor out of how many? That's a lot of different ancestors. If you emphasize his evilness, then you fall prey to that evil because you associate yourself with it, as opposed to your parents and your other grandparents and great-grandparents who were wonderful people, who had all these things they went through to make sure that they could pass on their genes, raise their families in safety, and make you who you are today. All right? And the thing is that is what we honor. We don't have to honor your great-grandfather stealing a horse, although it's kind of fun when you have an ancestor that does some of the naughty things. But ultimately, you don't have to honor it. But you can still be proud of where you come from, and you can honor your ancestry, and you can feel good about it. Now, let's talk a little bit about Confederates and the Soviet Union. Now, I've been to Russia quite a few times. Last time was in 2008. And the interesting thing was, the first time I went was around 2000. And I went to this place where they had a whole bunch of statues of all these communist leaders. It was sort of a junkyard or something. I don't know what the whole thing was. I don't think it was like a really, they were just going to dispose of these. But I guess people could come along if they wanted and maybe purchase statue of Leonid Brezhnev or something like that. They have pictures next to a statue of Leonid Brezhnev. But the thing is that a lot of this stuff was kind of gotten away with, but there is a lot of, still in Russia, you see red stars on public buildings with sickle and hammers. Okay. You do see some statues of Lenin and portraits of Lenin in the subways and so forth. And so you see a lot of reminders of their communist era from 1917 to 1991. Now, the thing is, you don't see a lot of communists, all right? And I really don't think there's this, like, some people think that, oh, they're still communists. They're just going to wait and spring it and say, oh, surprise, we are communists, and we fell for the fact that we were democratic. No, that's not the case. You can't get 140 million people in on the whole, conspiracy, okay? You wouldn't be able to get that many people in, the whole Duma can't be in on this. But here's the thing. The reason why, even though the only communists you see, sometimes you'll see a little demonstration in Russia, they all look like Bernie Sanders. In fact, they're usually older than Bernie Sanders. You don't see that many young people, communist protest in Moscow or St. Petersburg. In fact, the largest communist protest I've ever seen actually in Europe was one in Rome. There was maybe a couple thousand people there. But in Russia, you don't see it. But they still have these symbols. And it's because they're trying to honor the positive aspects of their history. There's not that many people in Russia that think, oh yeah, Joseph Stalin was a great guy. All the killings and the gulags and all this stuff was a great period of history. But they understand that there's more to their history than just the negative parts that took place during the communist era. And so therefore, during a Victory Day celebration, honoring their veterans from World War II, there will be people marching who will have communist banners. But they're not communist, okay? They are merely showing that they honor what their parents, and well, many times them, but their parents and their grandparents and their great-grandparents lived through. And they don't want to go back to communism. They don't want to reestablish gulags. They're just showing that there were some proud times that went along with the negativity of communism. And so you get a very comprehensive view of history. All right? And I think they'll probably maintain it. You will not see a situation in which you will have people going out and demanding that all of the emblems on buildings that are communistic emblems be chiseled off. Nor should they, really. Because again, there's not some sort of plot that they're all going to, jump up. Okay, so the thing is that now I get to the Confederate issue. There are a lot of elements, and I still think that the driving force is the hard left in the United States. That took a tragedy like that crazy guy that went in and shot people up at a church last year, which I thought was kind of interesting that when that happened, everyone blamed him for his ideology, his alleged white supremacy or whatever, his negativity towards other races. They didn't say that, oh, this was an anti-Christian attack. But yet when you get other situations where you have killings in which, the guy wasn't some white male going in and doing something evil, then the issue that you get from the U.S., it seems like from left-wing politicians in America is that it's guns. The gun is to blame. We need to blame the guns. And what we should do is get rid of guns, and then evil people won't do evil things. Well, that's kind of stupid, really, because sometimes these evil people are making bombs and stuff, and that would take out a lot more people. But still, they used this event from last year to demonize the Confederate flag, to demonize Confederate war memorials, and wanting to take them down. In fact, it's even gotten to the degree now where, I read that there was some university somewhere, or whatever, they were wanting to, there was people that wanted to take down the statue of Woodrow Wilson, the U.S. president during World War I. And the thing is that, if you read the hard left stuff that you can find on the internet, you can go to their websites and stuff. They're not going to be really happy until they, essentially that someday Washington, D.C., you'll go through and the Jefferson Memorial and the Washington Monument are going to get a name change because, well, we can't honor people that owned slaves back, 200 or 300 years ago. Now, the thing is, let's just, talking about the Confederate flag thing, yes, it has been tarnished to a certain degree because you do get racist groups that will fly the Confederate flag. Although I have seen, I've seen pictures of when the Nazi Party in the United States was pretty strong, back in the 1930s, in which they would use American flags as their symbol and, talk about how patriotic they were, because they were Nazis. The thing is that, I don't think too many people, when they would watch like Dukes of Hazzard or something, when you had the car, the General Lee, okay, already people are like, oh, no, we got to get rid of references to General Lee, Robert E. Lee. And then with a Confederate flag on the top of the car. When people in the 80s watched that show, they weren't suddenly desiring, they weren't like thinking this was a racist show. They weren't thinking of any kind of racial motives at all that I know of. But yet now everything's been demonized. Now you just a few years ago, I saw a documentary. It showed a photo shoot of a model, and she was wearing a Confederate flag bikini. And now you probably would never see a mainline, photo shoot or something, or an ad commercial with a Confederate bikini on. You might have it for, I don't know, maybe a gun show or, libertarian convention or something like that. But it would not be for, mainstream anymore. And it's gotten to the point where there's a lot of places that used to sell the Confederate flag that aren't selling it anymore because of all this, like, oh no, it's a racist symbol. And I can tell you this, you look back at pictures of Kennedy, there was pictures of John F. Kennedy giving speeches in the South where there was a big Confederate flag in the background. And so forth. Maybe we need to stop honoring John F. Kennedy. Obviously he must be a bad guy because he was giving a speech with a Confederate flag in the background. The thing is, and then taking us further, the wanting to take down monuments to Confederate causes and so forth. I will say this, when I was in New Orleans and I saw many of these things that are now people want to take down, I didn't think anything, it wasn't like I suddenly started getting this desire to, let's reestablish the old South, with slavery and stuff like that. I just thought it was interesting, and it was an aspect of history that made that area unique. I didn't think anything of it. And I don't think that when you would have parades and stuff in the South where people had Confederate flags, that they were like those secret communists in Russia today. They aren't suddenly thinking, okay, we're just waiting in, surprise, it's back to the South again, the old ways before the Civil War. No, they're honoring an aspect of their past. They're honoring, when you have a Confederate War Memorial, 700,000 men died in the Civil War. And I don't know what the specific figure was for how many of those men were from the Confederacy. But still, you don't want to suddenly, demonize these men who, many of them, Southern people today, that was their ancestors, or at least indirect family, extended family. There should be an honor for their bravery. They weren't going out there, the average man was not going out there, thinking, I, hate other races and I shall, fight. I mean, there was blacks and Hispanics and American Indians who fought in the Confederacy, for the Confederacy. In fact, the Cherokee Indians were pretty awesome fighters. I think they were like the last regiment to surrender at the end of the war, one of the Cherokee regiments. The thing is that today it's being changed. People in the South have this idea of what their symbols mean, but it's been demonized in the general community. Then that general community does not have a very good grasp of history. And so they'll accept the narrative that they're going to see presented on talk shows on TV and by these movies that will present the demonization of anything that has to do with the South. Even if it's set nowadays, it's always like some guy goes in, has to battle corruption in a small Southern community, and that sort of thing. Southerners get a lot of negativity. In fact, even in comedies, if you want to present someone as being kind of dumb, you have them talk like this, and then, that makes them look, really stupid and that sort of thing, which is very unfair. I don't think there's any correlation between, talking with a Southern accent and having a lower IQ. But the thing is, this has been the narrative. This is the narrative out there. And I think that there's a reason for this, especially this whole big push of getting rid of statues and flags and stuff like that nowadays. And that is that the best way to control a people is to control their history. And if you take a look at, there's a quote from George Orwell: "He who controls the past controls the present and controls the future." Okay? That means that if you are the one who is able to tell the story of a people's heritage or whatever, then you can control whether that'll be a positive portrayal or a very negative one. And you can get people hating people. You can get people loving people, depending on how you present that history. I mean, there's a lot of people that walk around with these Che Guevara, for instance, T-shirts. They have no idea who Che Guevara was, who he liked to shoot, and all this kind of stuff. But they think, it looks cool and dynamic and all this kind of stuff. And that's because you don't see a lot of documentaries about Che Guevara. All right? I mean, obviously. If you did, maybe people wouldn't be wearing those things. Now, I want to throw in a couple other quotes here. Here's one from Walt Disney. Walt Disney. Our heritage and ideals, our code and standards, the things we live by and teach our children, are preserved or diminished by how freely we exchange ideas and feelings. He seems to feel that we should have an open society, that maybe we should communicate. Maybe, I don't know how Disney would have felt about political correctness. I mean, if we judge by his movies, in fact, there's a lot of the hard left that really despises the old classic Disney movies. And I think that they, if you read their reasoning, it's not, it's kind of into the idea that, the whole Disney princess thing. I have my own problems with the whole Disney princess thing myself, but not for the reasons that the left does. The left feels that they reinforce certain views of beauty and, she gets married and lives happily ever after. Well, that's male patriarchal oppression and stuff like that. I guess if his movies would have had Snow White and Cinderella, exchanging kisses and running off into the sunset, that would have been, something they would have preferred the movies be. And who knows, but maybe in the future that'll be the norm instead of the exception. But still, what Disney says there about exchanging ideas and having a discussion, I think, is something that we're dangerously getting close to not being able to do that anymore. Now, another quote. Let's throw that in there and consider it. Cesar Chavez, the union leader. And he says, preservation of one's own culture does not require contempt or disrespect for other cultures. You know, I think that's a very important point. That's a very important point, because I think to a certain degree that our culture has gotten to this level in which you want to erase other people's cultures for, you know, just being able to replace them with something else. And many of the left may feel like, well, we should get rid of all these Confederate war memorials and stuff like this because it will make people happy. Well, I will say that much of the reason why people feel negative to a lot of these memorials is because of the antagonism that's been promoted by the left itself. And so people have an idea that, you know, that if the average Confederate soldier, for instance, was probably nothing more than some stormtrooper, you know, from an old Nazi movie or Star Wars or something like that. You know, really bad guys that just had evil intent in their hearts, which is not the case. But the thing is that, you know, what would actually be behind the agenda of getting rid of other culture? And in fact, of erasing culture altogether. Because I will say, there have been things that have been done by the United States to erase American Indians' cultures, as well as Europeans who moved here back, like, let's say, if you're a Scandinavian immigrant back in the 1800s, you were strongly encouraged just to kind of blend in. You know, don't teach your kids your native language, kind of get rid of being Scandinavian, become American. You know, and the same was true for other immigrant groups as well. But the thing is, what is the goal today? I think ultimately what many in the left want, despite what they may claim, is a culture in which everyone is the same. Ultimately, they don't realize, or maybe some of them do, that this is kind of an agenda of many elite type people who just want America to be where your cultural identity is defined by the label of clothes you wear, or the kind of job you have, or your taste in entertainment. And that's what will be your definition. Not who you are, where you came from, where your ancestors were from, what they did, and all that kind of stuff. But it'll be an identity based on consumerism. And when you have that, it'll be much easier to control people. It'll be much easier just to say, hey, look, here's what we're going to do. And then when people may grumble about it, it won't be in that same sense as, for instance, when Pope Paul, and it was Paul, I think, yeah, in Poland, when the Polish people rallied around their Catholicism, their Polish identity to say, we don't want to be communist anymore. It was easier for them to find identity with each other in order to throw the communism out. And like Chavez says, it doesn't mean that because you support your own culture means you must also disrespect other people's culture. That, you know, you don't have to do that. But the thing is that if you get rid of culture altogether and replace it with some sort of plastic, glitzy, consumer-driven alternative, it'll be so much easier just to keep everyone pacified through, well, you know, sports, through entertainment, reality shows, pornography, celebrity gossip, and trendy clothes styles, and those kinds of discussions. And that is the danger with getting rid of our cultural relics. All right? If we do that, then the danger is a society in which you lose all of your identity, and then therefore you lose all your freedom. And I think that is, ironically, one of the reasons why in Russia they don't chisel away all the stuff that, that symbolizes 1917 to 1991. Because they understand that this links people to their past. And it's part of, and it will always be part of Russian history and identity. In the same way that, a memorial to Robert E. Lee someplace in the South is, will, in my opinion, be part of Southern legacy for eternity, just like you may have monuments in Salt Lake City to Brigham Young, even though, maybe someday the majority of people in Utah won't be Mormon. They still can look to Brigham Young as being the person that kind of brought people over and set up the beginnings of Utah and building up Utah as a very, populous and important state in the Union. So you don't have to suddenly think, okay, well, let's see here. We're at 55% non-Mormon and only 45% Mormon. So we need to take down all the monuments to Brigham Young. I'm sure the hard left would support that, but it wouldn't be because they supported the feelings of the 55% who weren't Mormons. Okay. It would be because they would want to get rid of Brigham Young as a symbol for certain other things. Political, social, family, whatever. And I think that's what the left is really motivated by. And that is why we need to kind of say, look, enough is enough. We don't need to be trouncing on other people's rights or anything. We don't want that. And neither do the people who might have a Confederate flag decal on the back of their truck. They're not people generally who are wanting to restore some sort of oppressive system towards minorities any more than, the Russians want to restore communism. It is because it's part of their history as much as it, go through Europe. There's all these all these statues and all this honoring kings that many cases were very despicable people, but it's still part of their ancestry and gives you an anchor into your own origins. And I think that's what's really important here. We need to preserve our heritages because we need to have that anchor that connects us and makes us a stronger person, no matter if you're black, white, Asian, Hispanic, whatever. It gives you an identity that allows you to see that there's something bigger than big government. In the next few minutes, I would like to discuss, of all things, fertility and holidays. Okay. First, though, before we get into that, I'd encourage people to check out my writings on related subjects at my website at michaelcross.net. If you're on Twitter, please follow me at PsychoMike777. And of course, all my shows, well, most of them, are recorded and then put onto YouTube. And you can find that at my website at Michael Cross. Now, you're probably thinking, fertility in the holidays, what's that? You got a little spare time, maybe you make a baby or something. Okay. Well, actually, it's not too far from the truth. If you really think about it, if you look at the origins of our holiday seasons, let's take a look at a few of them. In Europe, they have like around May Day. Of course, in many people associate May Day with communists, but ultimately May Day or Midsummer in some countries was a time that you welcome the spring. And what you wanted was, the sun was out, it was bright, and, maybe the testosterone levels of people is up because the more sunlight you get, the higher your testosterone levels and all those other good aspects of human physiology. And you wanted your crops to be fertile, your animals to bear young, and, your wives to have babies and so forth. And this was very strongly associated with fertility. If you look at many of the aspects of the maypoles from from Scandinavia, but also other parts of Europe, you'll find, oh, wow, there's some very phallic. Anyway, obviously it didn't take Sigmund Freud to be able to figure those things out, if you look at them. But ancient cultures, I will say this, they didn't see sex and sexuality in the way that our modern media does. It wasn't some big porn thing or something like that. There was a very strong respect for fertility and sexuality, because this was to enable you to continue the family line, to make babies. That was seen as a good thing, which is something our society has gone away from, which I will get to in just a moment. If we look at other holidays, Christmas, this was a period when people celebrated the ending of, the lengthening of days and the welcoming of the eventual return of spring. The Catholic Church, of course, kind of took it and made it something totally different, because, Jesus was not born on December 25th, okay? He was not born on December 25th. But there was all kinds of pagan holidays and fests that were taking place in Northern Europe and Rome and so forth, and they wanted to supplant them. People could still party on the 25th, but there would be a celebration of Jesus rather than a celebration of fertility, and maybe a connection to the pagan gods. But like I've said before, the whole thing with sacrificing a ham in the Nordic areas, that was to give honor to Freya, the goddess of fertility. And it still stays with a Christmas ham, which is the ultimate irony of all, because Jesus never ate pork. But then, of course, you've got St. Valentine's Day, which has nothing to do with a saint. It has to do with the Feast of Lipicerna, which was a big fertility festival in Rome. You've got some societies in Europe that have they set bonfires during the spring, around the changing of the seasons from spring to from winter to spring. A lot of times they just named the holidays after some Catholic saint or something, instead of following the traditions. You can see, if you look up on YouTube, the Beltane, you'll see how it was celebrated in the old days, and it was a fertility ritual. But now, a lot of people look at these ancient cultures and they think, oh my gosh, these pagan cultures doing all kinds of naughty things, and that's so primitive. But you know what? They had a higher respect for fertility than we do today. In fact, I would say they had a more mature attitude towards fertility than we do today. You see, sex and sexuality, if we take a look at our modern world, we teach our kids that the absolute worst horrible thing that could happen if they have sex is that they could either catch a really horrible venereal disease or they might get pregnant. And we think to ourselves, well, this is just to protect them so they don't go out there and mess around and wind up pregnant or with a disease. But then we think they'll all of a sudden have a very positive attitude towards sex, sexuality, and having babies when they get to be adults. I personally think there's a hidden agenda there. I really do. I really think that part of the drive for the sex education, as we know it, I have no problem with teaching about sex. No problem whatsoever. In fact, I think much of American society you could deal with a much deeper aspect of sex and sexuality than would be allowed in kindergarten through K-12. I don't think that you should teach kids sex and sexuality in kindergarten. I'm just talking, the K through 12 system. But if they're in like late middle school or high school, there's ways you can present it that would be life affirming, not, oh my gosh, you get pregnant, which I think is actually part of it, is to get people not to want to have kids. And if you get them young, it's just like if you teach a young person that their body is shameful and horrible and, they should cover it up and everything, and then you expect them to be really, really, open towards sexuality when they get married. Of course you don't think that. A lot of problems in marital relationships are based on false teachings that are given when someone is younger. However, the same is true of sexuality when it comes to the way it's taught, the way that the media just makes it more pornographic, okay, than anything that is something that is to be revered. Our ancestors looked at these things as, again, spiritual. I think to a certain degree that could have been twisted by the Catholic Church, who kind of, they made it to where, they honored the whole idea of having babies and, having kids and stuff like that. But the whole sex and original sin and all that kind of stuff, and, that, there was where you were saying, oh, the sexuality part, ooh. But in our society, we say, oh, the sexuality part, great. The kid part, ooh. And that's very unhealthy. In fact, I think to a large degree, it's the reason why we have such a low birth rate in the West. We have an open society, but it's not a mature society. We have a view of sexuality that is consumeristic, plastic, that is something that's more entertainment. In fact, the whole aspect of porn, I was talking to someone the other day about this. I don't necessarily think there's a lot of stuff I've heard from people that are against porn about, physiological changes in the brain, stuff like that. I mean, if you study up on it, you find, no, that's probably not the case. Psychology does not recognize porn addiction and stuff like that. But the problem I have with the whole issue of pornography is you're taking something that is intimate, that is the basis of our survival as a species, that being reproduction, and you make it into a commodity. It is nothing more than something to attract people, to pay, to watch people engaging in sex. Okay? You cheapen it that way. The ancients did not do that. They revered it. And while some of the ancient traditions may have, if we look at them through the eyes of 21st century people, we might think, well, that looks kind of pornographic, maybe some of their rituals. The thing was that they looked upon it as a spiritual thing. And maybe we need to do that. The ancient Hebrews did not look upon sexuality as being a really horrible thing, like original sin, that sort of thing. They looked upon it as being something that should be controlled because it was a life force. You didn't just go out there and do it with everyone. It was part of God's creative process. So therefore it was honored and revered as part of a spirituality. In fact, the Song of Solomon is highly revered by Jews. Most Christians would, they kind of read through that kind of like, ooh, this is kind of naughty. But it's in the Bible. But the thing is that it's looked down upon to a certain degree. And some people say, well, it's not really scriptural. Well, neither is the book of Esther if you're talking about God's intervention being necessary for something to be spiritual. And neither, I guess, much of Psalms and Proverbs and stuff like that would not fit under those categories. But still, it's there, and it symbolizes the way that Jews looked upon sexuality. Now, in our society today, we need people getting married. We have a marriage rates are at a lower point than they ever have been. We have a birth rate that's at lower point than it ever has been. And our birth rate's higher in America than it is in Europe. And the thing is, we need to reaffirm the importance of sex being connected to reproduction. Doesn't mean it has to be all reproduction, but it is a foundational part, okay? You don't just eat bread and a chunk of meat and some water or something for every meal, even though that would probably keep you going. Humans need something deeper than that. And the thing is that we can't just look at sex as being recreation. It has to also be connected to this life-affirming aspect of humanness. And otherwise we do wind up not having kids and, perishing, being replaced by some people that have a better attitude towards it, or at least one that's more pro-natal. So I would say that it's not just a false dichotomy. You're either with the pagans and you're some sort of, everything is sexuality, or you're with American society and it's all, it's all like a commodity. I think you can have something totally different, and that is actually something much more akin to traditional family values, and seeing it as a very important power, something that should be revered. And when someone finds out they're pregnant, they shouldn't, we have to get past this whole, like, it's almost like you've just announced you've got a venereal disease or you've got cancer or something like that, which seems to exist within much of the population today subconsciously, like, oh my gosh, I'm pregnant, or you're pregnant, or these kinds of things. It should be something that it's congratulatory, like, yay, and it doesn't matter whether you have 2, 3, 4 kids already. It should still be a yay. This is a blessed event versus, oh, wow, what am I going to do, or what are you going to do? Because a successful society is one that continues itself generation after generation, and one that the ultimate in being not successful is to die out biologically. Okay? So keep that in mind sometime when you're thinking about these issues. Anyway, we're out of time now. So thanks for listening, and I hope you'll tune in next week for another episode of Unlock the Door Radio here on UCY TV Productions.
Skateboard, and you're listening